The summer of 1914 was perfect. It was a season of clear skies and golden fields. Across the capitals of Europe, life moved with an easy rhythm. In London, the season was at its peak. Débutantes danced in ballrooms. Families picnicked in Hyde Park. In Paris, the cafes were full. Artists and writers argued in the smoke of Montmartre. In Berlin, military bands played in the Tiergarten. It seemed that the peace, which had held for 40 years, would last forever. But it was a fragile peace. Beneath the calm, the ground was shifting. Old hatreds were simmering. New ambitions were rising. Europe was a powder keg. Dry. Unstable. Waiting for a spark. The nations were divided into two armed camps. The Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain. And the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. They were bound by secret treaties, by military conventions, by railway timetables. It was a system designed to keep the peace. But it was a machine built for war. And that spark would come from a place few could find on a map. Sarajevo, a provincial capital in the turbulent Balkans. But the story begins before Sarajevo. It begins in Belgrade, in the smoky coffeehouses of the Serbian capital. There, young students gathered to dream of a greater Serbia. They dreamed of freeing their Slavic brothers from Austrian rule. They were poor, they were angry, and they were dangerous. Behind them stood a secret group, unification or death, known as the Black Hand. Its leader was Colonel Dragutin Dimitrievich, codename Apis, the Bull. He was the head of Serbian military intelligence, a man of immense strength and terrifying will. He had already killed a king and queen in 1903. Now, he had a new target. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne. Apis recruited 3 young men for the job. Gavrilo Princip, Nedeljko Kabrinović, Trifko Grabez. They were barely men, teenagers. Princip was 19, small, pale, sickly. He had failed his exams. He felt he had nothing to live for. But he had something to die for. In a park in Belgrade, they were taught to shoot. They were given FN Browning Model 1910 pistols. They were given hand grenades. Rectangular, heavy, filled with nails. And they were given cyanide capsules. You must not be taken alive, they were told. They smuggled the weapons across the border. They moved like ghosts through the borderlands. The route was whispered about in coffeehouses as the Canal, a secret underground railroad for revolution. It began at the Drina River, the natural border between Serbia and Bosnia. On the island of Isakovica Ada, they waited in the reeds. The water was cold, dark, swirling with the melting snows of spring. They waded across in the dead of night, chest deep in the freezing current, holding their weapons above their heads. On the other side, a smuggler named Jakov Milovic was waiting in the shadows. He led them through the mountain passes, through mud that sucked at their boots, through rain that chilled their sickly bones. Princip was coughing, feverish. But he marched on. They slept in haylofts, in abandoned stables, hiding their deadly cargo, the bombs and the pistols, in sacks of grain on packhorses. Every policeman was a threat. Every glance from a stranger could be their end. But they passed unseen, like a virus entering the bloodstream of the empire. Finally, they arrived in Sarajevo and waited. June 28, 1914. A Sunday. The sun beat down on the white streets of the city. It was a special day. Saint Vitus Day. A day of holy mourning for the Serbian people. The anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, where the medieval Serbian kingdom was crushed by the Ottoman Turks in 1389. For a Serbian nationalist, it was a day of pain, a day of memory. And on this day of all days, the conqueror was coming. Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He represented everything the nationalists hated. He was the symbol of the oppressor. He came not in peace, but in uniform. A field marshal's tunic, green with gold braid. A hat with green ostrich feathers. He was there to inspect the army corps, to show the might of the Habsburg Empire on the very border of its enemy. It was an act of supreme arrogance, or supreme foolishness. Beside him the open car sat his wife, Sophie. She was the love of his life, but she was also the source of his greatest pain. She was not of royal blood. She was a mere countess, a lady in waiting. At the rigid court in Vienna, she was treated with cold disdain. The Emperor Franz Joseph had only allowed the marriage on one condition. It would be morganatic. Her children could never inherit the throne. She was a non-person. In Vienna, she could not sit in the royal box. She could not ride in the royal carriage. At state dinners, she had to walk behind the youngest archduchesses. It was a daily humiliation, 1,000 small cuts to her pride. But here, in this provincial outpost, the strict protocol of the Hofburg did not apply. Here, as the wife of a field marshal, she could sit beside her husband. She could be treated with the respect she deserved. It was their wedding anniversary. She wore a white dress and a large hat with a veil. She smiled at the crowds. She was happy to be by his side. But behind the scenes, chaos reigned. The security was fatally flawed. The police chief, Dr. Gerda, had warned the governor, General Poscharek, "I have only 40 men. I cannot secure the route. I need the army," but Poscharek refused. "There are no soldiers in the city," he said. "The maneuvers are over." Poscharek was arrogant. "I take full responsibility," he boasted. And so, the motorcade set off. 6 cars in a line. In the first, the mayor and the police chief. In the second, the target, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. Opposite them sat Poscharek. In the front, the owner of the car, Count Herach, sat next to the driver, Leopold Lochta. The third car carried Sophie's lady-in-waiting, and the driver, Lieutenant Colonel Marizzi. Then followed the staff officers, Baron Morsi, Colonel Bardolph. The last car was empty. A reserve. They drove down the Apple Quay. The river Miljacka flowed quietly beside them. Hidden among the cheering onlookers were the assassins. 6 of them. The first was Mohammed Basic. It was 10 o'clock when the cars passed him. He froze. He did nothing. Later, he would claim he couldn't see which car held the Archduke. A flimsy excuse. The motorcade rolled on. To the next man. Kabrinovich. He was more determined. He asked a policeman, "Which car is His Highness in?" Kabrinovich pulled the pin from his bomb. He struck it against a lamppost to activate it. A loud crack. He threw it. The driver, Lochta, saw the black object flying through the air. He slammed his foot on the gas. Franz Ferdinand saw it too. He raised his arm to protect his wife. The bomb hit his arm, bounced off the folded roof of the convertible, and rolled into the street behind them. It exploded under the third car. A deafening roar. Smoke filled the street. Lieutenant Colonel Marizzi was hit in the neck. Count Buz-Waldeck was wounded. Spectators screamed in pain. Kabrinovich swallowed his cyanide and jumped into the river. But the river was a joke. Only inches deep in the summer heat. And the cyanide was old. It didn't kill him. It just made him vomit. The crowd dragged him out of the mud and beat him savagely. The Archduke's car sped away to the town hall. The rest of the assassins, seeing the speed of the cars, did nothing. One said he felt sorry for the Duchess. Another admitted he was just too scared. At the town hall, the scene was surreal. The mayor, sweating and shaking, began his prepared speech. "Our hearts are filled with happiness." Franz Ferdinand exploded. "Mr. D. Mayor," he shouted, "I come here on a visit, and I am greeted with bombs. It is outrageous. He eventually calmed down. But the plan had to change. He wanted to visit Marizi in the hospital. But the hospital was on the other side of the city. Pocherek and Goethe argued about the route. "Is it safe?" the Archduke asked. Pocherek drew himself up. "Your Imperial Highness can drive on. I take the responsibility." They got back into the car. But no one told the drivers the plan had changed. They were supposed to go straight along the quay. But at the Latin Bridge, the lead car turned right into Franz Josef Street, the original route. Lochka, confused and uninformed, followed. Pocherek screamed, "You are going the wrong way." He shifted into reverse to get back to the quay. For a few fatal seconds, the car stood still. Princip was in the cafe. He looked up in surprise. The Archduke's car had stopped right in front of him. He stood up, rushed into the street. From just a few meters away, he drew his pistol and fired twice. The first bullet punched through the car door. It deformed, became sharp-edged and spinning. It struck Sophie in the abdomen. It tore through her insides. She was bleeding to death internally within moments. Franz Ferdinand saw she was hit. He screamed, "Sophie, don't die. Live for our children." Then the second shot. It hit the Archduke in the neck, tearing the jugular vein, injuring the trachea. Count Harash, sitting in the front, turned and grabbed the Archduke's shoulder. "Majesty, what is it?" he cried. Franz Ferdinand whispered, "It is nothing." And then, he lost consciousness. He wasn't bleeding from the neck wound itself, but into his windpipe, fed by the torn vein. The blood poured from his mouth, staining the front of his uniform dark red. Princip swallowed his cyanide immediately. But again, it failed. It only made him vomit. He tried to turn the gun on himself. But the mob was upon him. The pistol was wrestled from his hand. Gendarmes beat him with the hilts of their sabers as they dragged him away. He would later say he never meant to kill Sophie. The bullet was meant for Pocherek. Lochka turned the car around. He drove frantically to the governor's residence, the Konak. Doctors rushed in. They cut open the Archduke's uniform, desperate to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. Franz Ferdinand died there, in the Konak. The dream of a quiet anniversary was over. The nightmare of the 20th century had begun. But for Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, the indignity was not over. Even in death, the rigid protocols of Vienna would pursue them. The news reached the Emperor Franz Joseph in Bad Ischl. He did not weep for his nephew. He reportedly said, "A higher power has restored that order which I could not maintain." He meant the marriage. The unsuitable union was dissolved by death. Now, the problem of the funeral arose. The Lord Chamberlain, Prince Montenuovo, was the guardian of court etiquette. He had hated Sophie in life, and he was determined to put her in her place in death. He viewed the double funeral as a protocol nightmare. An archduke could have a state funeral. A mere countess could not. He decided to punish them both. The bodies were brought back to Vienna, not as heroes, but almost as an embarrassment. They were transported to the coast by the battleship Viribus Unitas, the pride of the Austrian navy, a ship the Archduke had loved. But once they reached Trieste, the honors stopped. The coffins were loaded onto a train, a slow train. They traveled through the night, arriving in Vienna late at night, almost in secret, to avoid crowds, to avoid sympathy. There would be no lying in state at the Hofburg Palace. Instead, the bodies were taken to the small chapel of the Artstetten Castle. No. First to the Hofburg Chapel for a brief ceremony. But the arrangement of the coffins was a final, calculated insult. Prince Montenuovo had given strict orders. The Archduke's coffin was large, ornate, surrounded by the symbols of his rank. It was placed on a high dais. Sophie's coffin was smaller, plainer, and it was placed on the floor below him. She was literally beneath him, even in death. And there was one more detail. A detail so petty, it shocked those who saw it. On Sophie's coffin, the chamberlain had placed a pair of white gloves and a black fan. These were the symbols of a lady in waiting. It was a message to eternity. Remember who she was. She was a servant, not a queen. The foreign courts were told not to come. No kings, no princes, no pomp. Montenuovo claimed the emperor was too old and frail to handle a large state funeral. It was a lie to keep Sophie hidden. The funeral mass was short, perfunctory. Only the immediate family was allowed. The public was kept away. And then, the final journey. They were not to be buried in the imperial crypt, the Kaisergruft, where the Habsburg emperors rested. Sophie was not allowed in, and Franz Ferdinand had chosen to be with her. He had built a crypt at his castle in Artzetten, far from Vienna, far from the court that had despised his wife. The hearse procession to the station was a gloomy affair. And then, as if the heavens themselves were angry, a storm broke. It was a violent summer storm. Thunder rattled the windows of Vienna. Rain lashed the cobblestones. The horses pulling the hearses spooked. Lightning flashed over the dark city. It was Gothic, ominous, a scene from a tragedy. The few spectators who braved the rain watched in silence. They saw the two hearses rattle over the wet stones, moving away from the center of power, into the darkness. It was a funeral without glory, without gratitude. The empire was burying its heir like a criminal. But as the lightning illuminated the wet streets, few realized what else was being buried. It wasn't just a man and his wife going into the dark. It was the old world. The world of emperors and waltzes, of colored uniforms and ostrich feathers, of rigid protocols and ancient dynasties. That world had died on a street corner in Sarajevo. And now, in the rain and the thunder, it was being carried away. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the holding of breath before the scream. The third-class funeral, as it came to be known. Sophie and Franz finally rested together, side by side, equals in the grave. But above them, the storm they left behind was just beginning to break. The insults of the court would soon be forgotten, replaced by the roar of artillery, the screams of dying men, and the fall of empires. The summer of 1914 was beautiful, but it ended in the dark.